The first time Thomas Green saw the boy, it was at the edge of the Magnolia Grove, where the white blossoms hung like paper lanterns in the dim morning mist. The child stood perfectly still, as if he had been waiting for hours, though his feet left no prints in the damp earth. Thomas knew the face, though it had not aged since the oil portrait in the upstairs hall. Matthew Green, missing 17 years, marked forever by the empty chair at the table and the whispered prayers at dawn and dusk. For months, the grove had been restless. Branches swayed without wind, and the old magnolia roots seemed to shift underfoot like breathing ribs. The Green family spoke of it only in careful fragments, always lowering their voices when the air grew heavy. In my own review of their history, collected from county records, an abandoned journal in the attic, and one very reluctant uncle, it became clear that the missing child was not a closed chapter, but a recurring verse in the Green lineage. The name changes every generation, but the pattern remains. Thomas had grown up hearing half-believed stories about an old agreement between the first settlers of Magnolia Hills and something that lived below the soil. His father dismissed them as superstition, yet still kept a pewter key hidden in his desk, the teeth worn smooth as if from decades of anxious handling. That key, Thomas would later discover, fit the iron lock on the stone slab at the grove's heart. The morning he saw Matthew, Thomas did not call out. He only watched as the boy turned his head in an oddly deliberate motion, like a portrait slowly coming to life. The child's eyes held neither fear nor welcome, only an unblinking intent, as though he were passing on a message older than language. Then, without a sound, Matthew stepped backward into the shadows, swallowed by the curtain of blossoms. By the time Thomas reached the spot, there was nothing but the scent of crushed petals and the faintest vibration under his boots. He pressed his palm to the soil and felt it. Not a pulse, exactly, but a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a sleeping breath that waited to wake. That was when I believe his doubts began to fracture. His notes from that week, written in an increasingly cramped hand, suggest the first intrusion of belief into a man raised on reason. At supper that night, the empty chair seemed less symbolic and more like a space reserved. The family's ritual prayers, spoken twice daily, took on a strange urgency, as though they were not addressed to heaven at all, but to something listening from beneath. Thomas said nothing of what he'd seen, though his silence was brittle, and he found himself glancing at the window, half expecting to see the boy's pale face framed in the glass. 2 nights later, the sound came. A knock, faint but deliberate, from the direction of the grove. 3 taps, a pause, and 2 more. The same pattern used to summon the household to table when Thomas was a boy. He lay awake until dawn, convinced that if he stepped outside, the boy would be standing there again. In later testimony, a neighbor claimed she saw a child-shaped shadow moving between the trees that same night, though she could not say if it walked or floated. What unsettled her most was that the shape seemed to stop at the exact center of the grove, where the stone slab lay hidden under years of moss and root. And the next morning, Thomas found something waiting at his door, a withered magnolia blossom, its petals marked with a smear of soil so dark it might have been ink. But the soil was warm, as if it had just been touched. Thomas crouched on the porch, his fingertips brushing the crumbled petals, testing the heat that clung to them. The warmth was wrong. No sun had touched the grove that morning, and the air still carried the brittle chill of late winter. He felt it pulse faintly, as though the blossom had been pressed into the earth by something alive. At breakfast, his mother's hands shook as she poured coffee. She noticed the blossom on the table before him, but said nothing, only pressing her lips into a thin line and glancing toward the empty chair. In my later interviews with her, she admitted recognizing it instantly. "That tree hasn't bloomed in months," she told me, voice hushed. "Not since the day we buried the last of them." She would not say who "them" referred to, and I suspect even she was unsure whether she meant the missing or the dead. That day, Thomas walked to the grove with deliberate slowness, as if prolonging each step could delay what waited there. The magnolias loomed like pale sentinels, their trunks etched with scars that looked almost deliberate. Spirals, hooks, and crude symbols that matched sketches I later found in the old family journal. The air was thick, saturated with the scent of decay beneath the sweetness of the blossoms. At the grove's center, he found the slab. It was larger than he remembered from boyhood. A rectangle of weathered stone, its edges half buried by roots that seemed to grip it like fingers. The lock, a squat lump of iron, protruded from one corner, though no hinge or seam marked a door. He thought of the pewter key in his father's desk and felt a tightness in his chest, as if his own breath had to fight the air to enter his lungs. He knelt, pressing his palm against the stone. The cold surface belied a slow, rhythmic vibration beneath, like something turning in uneasy sleep. It was in that moment the boy appeared again, standing on the far side of the slab. No sound announced him. He was simply there, framed by the twisting trunks. Matthew's lips moved, but the words did not carry. Thomas strained to hear, and for a moment believed he caught a single phrase, "It's your turn," before the boy stepped back and dissolved into the shifting shadows. Midday brought an unexpected visitor, Reverend Cole, the parish priest, who claimed to have felt a disturbance during morning prayer. He asked Thomas if he had heard the knocking yet, and when Thomas hesitated, the Reverend's eyes sharpened with something between pity and fear. "When it starts," he said, "you'll know what it means. Don't answer unless you're ready to give." That night, Thomas heard it again. 3 taps, a pause, and 2 more. Louder this time, more insistent, as though the knocker knew he had drawn closer to understanding. He lay frozen in bed, the rhythm echoing in his skull. When silence returned, it left behind a pressure in the air, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. By dawn, he resolved to test the boundary. If the knocks came again, he would go to the grove. He told no one of this decision, but I believe the choice had already marked him. In my experience, once a subject accepts the premise of the pact, whether spoken or not, the rest unfolds with a terrible inevitability. As the sun fell that evening, Thomas waited by the window, watching the magnolia grove darken into silhouette. When the knocking came, it was no longer faint. It rattled the air like a summons from deep underground. And this time, it was calling him by name. Thomas heard it as clearly as if someone stood just beyond the threshold, their voice threaded into the rhythm of the knocks. It was not shouted, nor whispered. It was spoken in the flat, unyielding tone of a command, one that expected obedience. The sound seemed to pass through the wood of the door, the walls, the very frame of the house, until it reached him with unnatural precision. He rose without lighting a lamp. His bare feet touched the cold floorboards, which seemed to pulse faintly beneath his steps. At the front door, he paused, hand hovering over the latch. A part of him, rooted in reason, in years of denying the old stories, insisted he should turn away. But beneath that, something deeper stirred, a pull as inevitable as the tide. When he opened the door, the night air wrapped around him with a heaviness that felt almost liquid. The grove stood ahead, black against the starlit sky. Between its trunks, a figure waited. Even at this distance, Thomas knew the pale oval of the boy's face, the unblinking eyes fixed on him. Without a word, Matthew turned and walked into the trees. Thomas followed. I've walked that path myself in daylight, and it is no more than a dozen steps from porch to grove's edge. Yet according to Thomas's later account, written in uneven, fevered script, it felt like a descent, each step stretching into an eternity. The air thickened, sounds dulled, and the light from the house behind him faded far too quickly. At the grove's heart, the stone slab glimmered faintly under the moon. Matthew stood beside it, one hand resting on its surface. His lips moved again, but now the words carried, "It's waiting." Thomas's voice came out harsher than intended. "What is?" The boy's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked downward toward the slab. "The one who keeps the land alive." Here lies a detail I find worth noting. In every recorded telling of the Green family's pact, the entity beneath is never named, never described in full. It is only the one, or the keeper. Whether this is superstition or strategy, avoiding names to keep them from gaining power, I cannot say. Matthew stepped back, gesturing for Thomas to kneel. Against every rational instinct he did. The stone's cold radiated up his arms, but beneath it was that same rhythm, steady, patient, almost reassuring if not for its unnatural depth. "Your father heard it too," Matthew said. "But he said no. That's why it took her instead." Thomas's head snapped up. "Her?" The boy didn't answer. He only smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips, before vanishing into the shadows as though he had never been there. Thomas remained kneeling, staring at the slab until the moon shifted and its light no longer touched the stone. When he finally stood, he found a small object in the dirt beside the lock. A pewter key, worn smooth by years of handling. His father's key. Returning to the house, he searched his father's desk. The drawer where the key had been kept was empty. This, I believe, marked the point where the last of Thomas's disbelief faltered. The key was not simply lost, it had been given. And if his father had chosen to pass it on, then the role Thomas was meant to play was not an accident. The next night, the knocking returned. Louder, faster, no longer patient. And when he answered, it wasn't the boy who was waiting. The figure on the porch was taller, broader, shoulders stooped but frame unmistakably that of an adult. No face was visible at first. The head was bowed, letting the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat swallow the features. The knocking had stopped, yet the air still vibrated as if the sound were trapped between them. Thomas gripped the pewter key in his fist. "Who are you?" he asked, but the words felt strangely muted, as though the night swallowed half of them. The figure raised its head. In the moonlight, the eyes caught and held Thomas's gaze. They were not luminous in the ordinary sense. They reflected no light, but they possessed a density, as if looking into them was like staring into the heart of deep water. "I'm the one who comes when the keeper grows hungry," the man said. His voice was low, even stripped of anything human beyond its cadence. "I've read many accounts of pacts, both folkloric and documented, and this exchange fits a familiar pattern. There is always a messenger beyond the first lure, a figure who appears once the chosen person has touched the threshold. Often, their role is to confirm the inevitability of what's to come, not to offer escape." Thomas stepped back, but the man did not advance. Instead, he nodded toward the grove. "It won't wait much longer." "I haven't agreed to anything," Thomas said. "You don't have to," the man replied. "It's in your blood." That last phrase struck Thomas harder than he expected. It suggested not just inheritance, but inevitability. The same inevitability that had claimed Matthew, and perhaps others before. The man turned without further words, walking into the grove. His stride was unhurried, confident, as if the darkness parted for him. Thomas followed, the key burning cold in his palm. When they reached the slab, the man stopped and placed a hand on the stone. Thomas realized with a jolt that the vibration beneath was stronger now, almost impatient. The man glanced back. "It remembers the taste." The slab shifted then, imperceptibly, but enough for Thomas to feel the change underfoot. A breath of air rose from the seam, a breath that carried a scent of earth, older than memory, threaded with something sweet and rotting. Thomas fought the urge to step away. "What happens if I don't open it?" The man's expression did not change. "It takes something else. Something near you. Something you'll miss." In that moment, Thomas thought of his mother's trembling hands at breakfast, the way she'd stared at the blossom. He imagined her face, slack and empty, disappearing into the grove the way Matthew had. The thought hollowed him. The man pressed a long, thin finger against the lock. When the knocking comes again, it will be for the last time. Answer, and you can choose the offering. Refuse, and it chooses. Without another word, he stepped back into the trees and was gone. Thomas stood alone by the slab, the night pressing close around him, the rhythm beneath the stone sinking with the thud of his own pulse. He closed his fist around the key until it bit into his skin. When he returned to the house, he locked the door behind him. But locks, he suspected, meant nothing to what waited in the grove. That night, he swore he could hear breathing in the walls. It was faint at first, a sound he could almost dismiss as the settling of old wood or the sigh of wind through the eaves. But the rhythm was too precise, too steady. An inhale drawn low, a pause, an exhale that seemed to graze the edge of his ear no matter where he stood. Thomas walked the length of the hallway with a candle, watching the shadows ripple along the warped plaster. The sound followed him. When he paused at his bedroom door, it paused too, and when he took one more step toward the window, it shifted, moving behind the wall as if pacing him from inside. In my review of his surviving notes, this was the first entry where his tone changed from reluctant curiosity to a kind of strained vigilance. He began marking the hours when the sound came, tracking whether it grew louder or weaker, and correlating it with the phases of the moon. These are the patterns that often appear when a subject starts to accept the phenomenon as real. The attempt to rationalize through measurement what the mind cannot reconcile. The following morning, Thomas went to the grove again, though he swore to himself he wouldn't. The magnolias seemed taller, their blossoms denser, the light beneath them dimmer even in daylight. The slab waited at the center, and the vibration beneath it was no longer subtle. He could feel it in his teeth, like the low hum of a distant engine. Someone had been there before him. The moss along one side of the slab was disturbed, scraped away in a rough, almost frantic patch. In the exposed stone, shallow grooves had been cut, fresh enough that the edges were pale against the dark weathering. He recognized them. They matched the crude spiral marks carved into the magnolia trunks. From the corner of his eye, movement flickered. Thomas turned, expecting the boy or the man in the hat. Instead, he saw a shape among the trees, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs slightly wrong in proportion, as though they had been assembled without full knowledge of the human frame. It did not move toward him. It only tilted its head in a slow arc, as though assessing the distance. Then, without a sound, it was gone. By the time Thomas returned to the house, the breathing in the walls had grown louder. He placed his ear to the plaster and froze. Beneath the steady inhale-exhale, he could hear something else, a faint tapping, irregular, almost like fingers trailing along the inside of the wall. That night, he dreamt of the slab. In the dream, the stone was gone and the ground beneath was a yawning black void. From it rose a sound like the ocean, but layered within, the roar was a voice. He could not make out the words, but he woke with the certainty that it had been speaking directly to him. He lit a candle and found the pewter key on his bedside table. He had left it in the drawer downstairs. Outside, the grove was silent, but the air pressed against the window panes like a held breath. When the knocking came again, it was from inside the house. The sound began in the parlor, sharp and deliberate, as if a single knuckle rapped against the far wall. Thomas froze halfway down the stairs, the candle trembling in his hand. A second knock followed, closer now, and then a third, this one so near he could feel the vibration in the banister under his palm. He stepped into the parlor. The air was dense, tinged with the faint sweetness of magnolia blossoms, though every window was latched tight. The knocks had stopped. In their place came a slow scrape, like fingernails dragged across the inside of the wall. I've studied countless cases where the phenomenon moves indoors once the subject's resistance begins to erode. It is a shift in territory, no longer a lure from a distance, but an invasion, an erasure of the boundary between the place of safety and the place of danger. Thomas crossed the room to the far wall and laid his palm against it. The plaster was warm, unnaturally so, as though it had absorbed heat from a hidden source. He pressed his ear to it and heard breathing, louder now, with a faint undercurrent of wetness, like air moving through a space lined with leaves or petals. The pewter key was in his pocket, its weight suddenly oppressive. He thought of the man in the hat, of the warning that refusal meant something else would be taken. By late morning, Thomas went again to the grove. The magnolias seemed to shift as he passed, branches bending inward to narrow his path. At the slab, the air vibrated with such force it made his vision blur. He knelt, examining the disturbed moss from the day before. This time, a new mark had been carved beside the spiral, a crude shape that, on first glance, looked like an open eye. "Do you know what it means?" The voice was behind him. Thomas turned sharply. It was Matthew, his clothes unchanged from the day he had vanished years ago. The boy was barefoot, though his feet left no mark in the dirt. "No," Thomas said. "Why don't you tell me?" Matthew tilted his head, his gaze dropping to the slab. "It means it's ready." Thomas's pulse hammered in his ears. "Ready for what?" The boy's lips curled into something almost like a smile. "For you to stop pretending you don't hear it." And then he was gone, vanishing as though the air had folded over him. When Thomas returned to the house, the smell of magnolia was stronger. He searched every room, opening cupboards, closets, even the attic hatch, but found nothing. Still, the air was heavy with that cloying sweetness. By evening, the knocking came again. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. This time it came from the wall beside his bed. He pressed his ear to the plaster, and a voice whispered so close it might have been inside his own skull. "You have the key. You know where it goes. Why wait?" He jerked back, the candle guttering in his hand. The wall was cool now, silent, but he could still feel the shape of the words pressed against his mind. Thomas lay awake until dawn, the key clenched in his fist. He knew he would go to the slab again. What he didn't know was that someone else would be waiting there first. Thomas reached the grove at dawn, the sky a pale wash of silver behind the jagged silhouettes of the magnolias. The air was still, yet the branches swayed as though disturbed by an unseen current. At the slab, a figure crouched, tracing the spirals on the stone with one gloved finger. It was the man in the hat. Without looking up, the man said, "You came sooner than I thought." His tone was flat, but there was a shadow of approval in it, like a teacher acknowledging a reluctant pupil's progress. Thomas held up the key. "You left this for me." The man shook his head. "I didn't leave it. It found you." He rose to his full height, his presence oddly larger than his frame, as though the shadows themselves leaned toward him. "The keeper has marked you. The choice is not whether you'll serve, but how. I note here that such statements often appear in accounts of inherited pacts. Language that removes agency, framing obedience as the only survivable path. It is a tactic of inevitability." Thomas's eyes flicked to the slab. The vibrations beneath it were stronger than ever, pressing faintly against the soles of his boots. "If I open it, what happens?" The man smiled thinly. "The cycle continues. The land thrives. And you remain. And if I refuse?" The smile disappeared. "Then it feeds on what you love until you change your mind, or until there's nothing left to change." Something shifted in the corner of Thomas's vision, a flicker of pale movement among the trees. Matthew stood there, silent, his gaze fixed not on Thomas but on the man. The boy's expression was unreadable, but there was tension in it, a tautness that made Thomas's chest tighten. The man stepped closer to the slab and laid his palm flat against it. The spirals seemed to darken under his touch, their grooves absorbing the light. "It's hungry now," he said. "Hunger makes it impatient. You should know, impatience is dangerous." The vibration deepened, resonating in Thomas's bones. He could feel it rising through him, a low, insistent thrum that made his fingers twitch toward the key. Matthew took a step forward, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to do it now." The man's head turned sharply. "Stay out of this." The boy ignored him, speaking only to Thomas. "It'll take what it wants if you open it, but it'll take more if you wait too long." The two statements tangled in Thomas's mind, neither offering safety, both promising loss. When Thomas looked down, the key was already in the lock. His hand had moved without conscious thought. The metal was cold, almost wet, as if it had been lying in the earth. The man watched him closely, eyes dark as unlit wells. "Once you turn it, there's no turning back." Thomas hesitated, his breath shallow. He could hear the slab's pulse matching his own. Somewhere far off, though it might have been inside him, came a sound like something vast shifting its weight. He pulled his hand back suddenly, stepping away. The man's gaze narrowed. "Then you've chosen the harder way." Thomas turned toward the house, but every step felt heavier, as if the grove were reluctant to release him. By the time he reached the porch, the knocking had already started again. It was faster now, each strike carrying the weight of something that had waited too long. Thomas stood at the bottom of the steps, every instinct urging him to turn and run, but the rhythm pinned him where he was. 3 knocks, pause. 2 knocks, pause. Then a single, deliberate thud that rattled the glass panes in the door. When he opened it, no one stood outside. The porch boards creaked under his own weight, but the air was still. He stepped out, scanning the yard, the grove beyond, the line where the moonlight fractured against the first trees. Nothing moved. Then the sound came again. This time from behind him, inside the house he had just left. He entered slowly, the candle's flame stretching long shadows along the hallway. The knocking led him toward the parlor, and when he crossed the threshold, the smell of magnolia hit him with suffocating force. A blossom lay on the center of the rug, its petals wet with the same dark soil he had felt days earlier. I've seen this before in accounts of escalating contact. The object tied to the phenomenon moves from neutral ground to the most intimate spaces, crossing thresholds that are never meant to be crossed. It's not only a sign of intrusion, it's a claim. The knocking stopped, replaced by a whispering sound. At first, Thomas thought it was wind through the chimney, but the tone was too focused, too measured. He moved closer to the wall and the words sharpened. "It's not patient anymore." The voice was Matthew's. Thomas pressed his palm flat against the plaster. "Where are you?" There was a long pause, and then softly, "Underneath." The floor seemed to shudder under him. Somewhere deep below he heard that ocean roar again, threaded with something like laughter. By morning, Thomas knew he couldn't stay in the house. He packed a satchel with the barest necessities. Water, a lantern, the key, and set out for the grove. The decision felt less like a choice and more like the closing of a door he hadn't realized was open. When he reached the slab, someone was already there. Not the man in the hat this time, but an older woman, her back bent, hair silver and loose down her shoulders. She was tracing the spirals on the stone with the tip of a knife, whispering in a language Thomas didn't know. She looked up when she sensed him. Her eyes were pale blue, clouded with age, yet sharp in focus. "You're late," she said. "Who are you?" "Someone who came before you, someone who thought I could refuse." She nodded toward the slab. "I was wrong." Her hands trembled as she offered him the knife. "It takes more than a key." Thomas stared at the blade, its edge blackened, as though it had been buried in the soil for years. The vibration beneath the slab intensified, and he felt his knees weaken under its pull. "Why are you here now?" he asked. "Because when it calls, we all come back." And with that, she turned and walked into the grove. disappearing between the trees as if the shadows had swallowed her whole. The moment she vanished, the slab began to shift. It was subtle at first, a low grinding beneath the earth, the sound of stone moving against stone. Thomas froze, the knife still clutched in his hand, the key burning cold in his pocket. The spirals carved into the surface seemed to twist, the lines narrowing and lengthening as though alive. Dust fell from the edges, and a faint breath of air escaped from the widening seam at its center. He stepped back instinctively. The vibration deepened, making his ribs ache. From below came a sound like the slow turning of something vast and heavy, accompanied by a smell of wet earth and something older. Something metallic, like blood left too long in the sun. Then came the voice. Not the boy's, not the man's. This one was deep, resonant, layered with tones that felt wrong in a human throat. "You carry the blood," it said. "You carry the debt." I have studied cases where the phenomenon speaks directly to the chosen, bypassing intermediaries entirely. It marks a progression toward culmination, a point at which refusal no longer delays the cycle but hastens its climax. Thomas tightened his grip on the knife. "If I walk away?" he asked. The slab's seam widened another fraction. "Then I take what you hide behind." His mind leapt to his mother again, her fragile hands pouring coffee, the way her eyes lingered on the empty chair. The idea of that chair holding another absence made his stomach twist. The voice came again, softer this time. "Choose." Before Thomas could speak, a shadow moved at the grove's edge. It was Matthew, standing still as carved stone. But he wasn't alone. Another figure stood beside him, a woman whose face Thomas recognized instantly despite the years. It was his Aunt Clara, missing since he was a child, her disappearance spoken of only in hushed fragments. She and Matthew stood hand in hand, their expressions blank, their eyes fixed on him. "You see?" the voice rumbled. "The ones who came before remain, waiting, serving." The seam widened again. A cold draft spilled out, carrying the faint sound of water dripping in a vast cavern. Thomas took a step forward, the pull nearly physical now, like a rope tightening around his chest. Matthew tilted his head, speaking for the first time. "It's not just you, it's all of us. Forever." The words struck him harder than the voice from below. They weren't a warning, they were a fact, spoken without hope or malice. Thomas's knees bent, lowering him toward the slab. His hand moved toward the lock, the key pressing into his fingers as if urging him on. Then a different sound broke through, the faint, deliberate knock from behind him. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. He turned sharply. The man in the hat stood at the grove's entrance, motioning him back with a single raised hand. "Not yet," the man said. "It's not ready to keep you." Thomas's gaze flicked between the man, the slab, and the figures of Matthew and Clara. The vibration beneath the stone seemed to falter, as if the presence below were momentarily listening. The man's voice carried low but clear. "If you open it now, you won't be the only one it takes." Thomas straightened slowly, the key still in his hand. He backed away from the slab, step by step until the pull eased. By the time he looked up, Matthew and Clara were gone. The grove was empty, silent except for the faint groan of the slab settling back into place. Thomas's breathing was loud in his own ears, each inhale jagged, each exhale tight. The man in the hat had already turned away, retreating into the shadows without a backward glance, leaving Thomas alone with the cold weight of the key in his palm. He didn't follow. Not at first. Instead, he lingered at the slab's edge, staring at the spirals until his eyes blurred. His thoughts raced, not in frantic bursts, but in a measured, methodical sequence. The way a man might rehearse the steps to a task he knows he will have to perform. In my review of his later writings, this was where his tone shifted once more. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by calculation. He began to dissect the events of the past days as though they were a sequence of tests, each escalating in severity, each meant to wear down his resistance. The breathing in the walls, the knocking, the appearances of the boy, the man, and now Clara. It was all a scaffolding for the inevitable moment. Thomas turned and made his way back to the house, but the air inside felt wrong, thicker, heavy with the faint tang of iron. The parlor window was open a crack, though he knew he had latched it. On the table lay another magnolia blossom, but this one had something pressed into its center, a single strand of hair, pale and unmistakably his mother's. He picked it up carefully, his jaw tightening. The warning was clear. That night, the knocking didn't come. Neither did the whispering in the walls. Instead, Thomas woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. He lit a candle and stepped into the corridor. The light caught on something ahead, the faint impression of bare feet on the wooden floorboards, each print damp as though from dew. He followed them to the kitchen. The back door was ajar, and outside, the grove loomed, its blossoms glowing faintly in the moonlight. For a moment, he thought he saw someone standing at the tree line, but when he stepped closer, the figure dissolved into shadow. I suspect this was the entity testing his threshold for pursuit, seeing how far it could draw him without the key's use. Such psychological probing is common in accounts of generational bindings. The goal is not to frighten the chosen into fleeing, but to draw them into alignment with the act itself. Thomas spent the following day in the attic, searching through his family's old ledgers and letters. He found a journal belonging to his grandfather, its pages brittle and yellowed. The entries were sparse but chilling, lists of dates, each paired with a name, followed by a single word, given. At the end of the list was an unfinished line. The date was blank. The name was his. The rest of the day passed in a haze. By evening, he sat at the kitchen table with the key before him, the knife beside it. The house was utterly still. Then the sound returned. Not knocking this time, but a slow, deliberate scraping from beneath the floorboards. It moved from one end of the house to the other, stopping directly beneath him. A voice rose from below, the same deep, resonant tone as before. "It's waiting for you now." And when Thomas stood, he knew he would answer. The decision felt less like a choice than an acknowledgement of something that had already been decided for him. He moved with slow, deliberate motions, slipping the pewter key into his pocket and taking the knife in his other hand. The scraping beneath the floorboards followed him as he crossed the house, a subterranean shadow mirroring his every step. When he opened the back door, the cold night air rushed in, sharp and metallic on his tongue. The magnolia grove loomed ahead, its blossoms ghost pale under the moon. Each step toward it felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted and urged him forward all at once. At the grove's edge, the scent of the blossoms was overpowering, sweet to the point of nausea. The slab at the center glimmered faintly, its spiral seeming to shift even without touch. The vibration was so strong now that Thomas felt it in the backs of his teeth. Someone was already there. The man in the hat stood beside the slab, arms folded, his expression unreadable. "You've kept it waiting long enough," he said. Thomas approached, each step sinking with the deep thrum beneath the stone. "And if I open it, you finish what your bloodline began." The man's eyes glinted. "And you make sure it doesn't take anyone else. For a while." That pause, for a while, did not go unnoticed. In many inherited pacts, the reprieve is temporary, a generational payment rather than a permanent solution. Thomas's gaze drifted to the spirals. "How many?" "More than you'd want to count," the man replied. "Less than it would take if you don't." The knife felt heavier in Thomas's hand. "And the knife?" The man's mouth tightened. "That's for the part you can't lock away again." Before Thomas could ask, movement caught his eye. At the far edge of the grove, Matthew stood watching. Beside him was his mother, alive but wrong somehow, her face too still, her eyes unblinking. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers laced in a gesture that looked more like restraint than prayer. "She's already marked," the man said softly. "It's her or you." The statement hit Thomas like a physical blow. The deep voice from beneath the slab seemed to swell in agreement, pressing against his skull. "Choose." Matthew tilted his head, and for the first time, Thomas saw something like pity in the boy's eyes. "It's never really a choice," he said. Thomas stepped forward, placing the key into the lock. The metal was ice cold, and the instant it slid into place, the vibration surged, nearly knocking him to his knees. The spirals darkened, absorbing what little moonlight reached them. The man in the hat moved to his side. "When it opens, step back. Don't look directly inside." Thomas turned the key. The lock released with a sound like stone cracking under pressure, and a seam of blackness split the slab in two. Cold air rushed upward, carrying the roar of something vast and ancient, and beneath it, a low, eager hum like breath drawn in anticipation. The man's hand closed on Thomas's shoulder. "You've got one chance to walk away after this." But when the slab began to rise, Thomas realized he had no intention of walking away. The stone lifted with agonizing slowness, roots stretching like tendons as they tore free from the soil. The spirals on its surface shifted and curled into new shapes, each turn revealing more of the black void beneath. The air that rushed out was colder than winter, heavy with the scent of wet stone and something faintly sweet, like fruit that had rotted from the inside. The man in the hat stepped back, eyes fixed on the widening gap. "Don't lean over it," he warned. "It notices." Thomas tightened his grip on the knife, but the pull from the darkness below was almost physical now, a slow drag at his chest. He thought he heard the faint drip of water again, but this time it was layered with whispers. Hundreds of them, overlapping, impossible to separate into words yet somehow understood. They were calling him down. I have read testimonies of similar thresholds. Moments when the chosen claims they can hear the presence beneath as clearly as a human voice. Often, it is described not as a command, but as an invitation, dressed in the tones of inevitability. Then he saw it. Not a form exactly, but movement, a ripple in the darkness, like the shift of something massive turning just out of sight. His skin prickled, and every instinct screamed at him to step back. But behind him, he felt another presence. He turned and found Matthew standing there, the boy's face pale but intent. Beside him was his mother, still unmoving, her gaze locked on the slab. Matthew spoke first. "It's hungry. If you leave it now, it will come for her." Thomas's stomach tightened. "And if I don't leave?" The boy's expression didn't change. "Then you'll take her place." The man in the hat gave no reaction, simply watching with an unsettling calm. "Time's up," he said. The slab shuddered, and a hand, if it could be called that, emerged from the darkness. It was long, too long, the fingers bending at unnatural angles, each joint tipped with a point like the root of some pale plant. It touched the ground just beyond the stone, leaving a smear of black soil that steamed in the cold air. Thomas's heart pounded. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a single, deep tone. It was the same voice he had heard through the floorboards, and now it was speaking plainly. "Give, or I take." The choice hung between them like a blade. He looked to his mother, her stillness no longer human, and knew the decision had already been made somewhere deep inside him. He stepped forward, placing the knife on the slab's edge. "Take me." The hand paused, the fingers curling in what almost seemed like approval. The void seemed to deepen, pulling at the edges of his vision until everything beyond it blurred. The man in the hat spoke again, his voice lower now. "Once you go in, you won't come back out. Not as you." Thomas did not look away from the darkness. "I know." And as the hand reached for him, he felt the cold flood through his chest, into his lungs, into his very thoughts. When the slab closed again, the grove was empty. No Matthew. No man in the hat. No mother standing silent among the trees. Only the magnolias, their blossoms trembling as though from a passing wind that Thomas could not feel. The moon hung low, pale and cold, and the spirals on the slab had stilled into their original shapes, though he could swear they were darker now, stained somehow by what had just occurred. Thomas's breathing came fast and uneven. He looked at his own hands, half expecting to see them altered, but they were his hands, his skin. Yet there was something wrong beneath them, a pressure that pulsed with each heartbeat, as if the vibration from the slab had been transferred into him. I have read in other accounts that after a taking, the chosen often experiences a period of dissociation. It is not uncommon for them to feel both present and absent at once, a dual awareness. One self standing in the world, the other listening from somewhere deeper, somewhere under. He turned toward the house, moving on unsteady legs. The grove felt thicker now, the trunks leaning inward, the path narrower. By the time he reached the porch, dawn had begun to creep across the horizon. Inside, the air was still. Too still. The scent of magnolia was gone, replaced by the dry, stale smell of an abandoned place. In the kitchen, the table was bare, the chairs neatly pushed in, all but one. The empty chair at the head of the table was gone. He searched the house, room by room. There was no sign of his mother, no signs of life at all. Dust lay undisturbed on the floors, as though the place had been vacant for years. Yet his own footprints, fresh and sharp, trailed behind him. It was then he noticed the sound. Not knocking this time, not breathing in the walls, but a faint, low hum coming from inside his own chest. He pressed a hand there and felt it. Steady, rhythmic, familiar. The same pulse that had always come from the slab. Thomas stepped to the mirror in the hallway. His reflection stared back at him, but there was something faintly wrong about the eyes. Not their shape or color, but their focus. They seemed to look past the glass, into some unseen distance. Then came the whisper. It was not from behind him, nor within the house. It came from inside his own head, soft but utterly clear. "Now you wait." Thomas gripped the edge of the mirror. For what? The answer came with the weight of inevitability. For the next. This is consistent with the cyclical nature of the accounts. Once the chosen has been taken, they become the harbinger for the next, bound to the same patterns, the same lures. Thomas backed away from the mirror. The hum in his chest seemed louder now, a signal he could not turn off. When he stepped outside again, the grove awaited, quiet and still, yet alive with an awareness that pressed against his thoughts. He understood, without being told, that he could not leave Magnolia Hills. The land had him now, and somewhere, unseen, something beneath the slab was patient again. But patience, he knew, would not last forever. The days that followed blurred into one another, yet Thomas could feel the weight of each one pressing closer towards something inevitable. The hum in his chest never stopped. Sometimes it was faint, almost ignorable, and other times it deepened until it rattled through his bones. At night, he dreamed of the slab, not a stone, but as a lid over some great mouth that shifted and whispered in the dark. He began walking the grove's perimeter at dawn and dusk, the way one might patrol the edges of a property to ward off intruders. Yet the grove was no intruder. It was the center, and he was the one bound to its will. The magnolias leaned subtly toward him now, their branches brushing his shoulders as if in greeting. Inside the house, strange changes took root. Doors he left open in the morning were closed by evening. Objects vanished from one room only to appear days later somewhere else. The mirror in the hall began to fog without reason, and sometimes, in its blurred surface, he thought he saw faces. Pale, watchful, patient. I have studied phenomena in which the chosen begins to inhabit both roles, guardian and lure. The transformation is gradual but undeniable. The signs include changes in perception, an increased sense of possession over the territory, and, most telling, the emergence of new visitations. It was on the 7th day that the first visitor came. A young man, no older than 20, wandered up the overgrown path. He claimed to be looking for work, said he'd heard there was a farm here once. But as he spoke, his gaze kept drifting toward the grove, as if the trees had called him from a distance. Thomas felt an unfamiliar tension in himself, part warning, part recognition. The hum in his chest deepened. "There's nothing for you here," he said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to still the air. The young man hesitated, then nodded and left without another word, though his eyes lingered on the magnolias until the path curved out of sight. That night, Thomas could not sleep. The hum was too loud, and beneath it he heard another sound, the faint but unmistakable knocking. It came not from the walls or the porch, but from the direction of the grove. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. He rose and went to the slab. The spirals glistened faintly under the moonlight, though the air was dry, and there, in the center, was a mark he had not seen before, a crude outline of a hand, smaller than his own, pressed into the stone as if burned into it. A whisper stirred in his mind. Soon. When he turned back toward the house, he saw her. His mother stood at the edge of the grove exactly as she had before the taking. Same clothes, same stillness, but her eyes glowed faintly, reflecting no light. "Why are you here?" he asked, though his voice faltered. Her lips moved just enough for him to hear the words, "To see the next one." The hum in his chest pulsed sharply, like a drum beat. And before Thomas could ask what she meant, he heard footsteps approaching the grove. They were deliberate, crunching softly over the carpet of fallen petals. Whoever it was moved with a strange certainty, as if they already knew the path without seeing it. Thomas felt the hum in his chest sharpen, its rhythm syncing with the steps. His mother did not move. Her gaze remained fixed on the approaching figure. Out of the shadows emerged a young woman, her clothes travel-worn, her hair tangled from the wind. She stopped at the first ring of magnolias, her eyes darting from the slab to Thomas, as if weighing which one was more real. "I don't know why I came here," she said, her voice unsteady. "I just knew I had to." Thomas recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same compulsion that had brought him to the slab weeks ago. He felt an ache of dread and inevitability in equal measure. The hum inside him wasn't warning him away this time. It was welcoming. I have read final entries in other cases where the chosen writes not of resistance but of recognition. In the last stage, they stop questioning the cycle. They prepare to hand it forward, even if it means stepping deeper into the role they once feared. "You should leave," Thomas told her. The words felt empty even as he spoke them. She shook her head. "I can't. It's been calling me." The air shifted. The spirals on the slab began to darken, and a faint vibration rippled through the ground. Thomas glanced at his mother, but she was no longer looking at the newcomer. Her gaze was on him. The next one. The phrase echoed in his mind, and he understood fully now. His purpose was not to feed the keeper this night, it was to prepare its next guardian. The young woman stepped closer. "Is it under there?" she asked, nodding toward the slab. Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and drew out the pewter key. The metal was warm now, almost pulsing in his palm. He extended it toward her. "You'll need this," he said. She stared at it, then at him. "What happens if I take it?" He could have lied, could have told her it was a choice she could still refuse, but lies had no place here. "Then it will never stop calling you." The moment her fingers closed over the key, the hum inside Thomas began to fade. It was replaced by a vast stillness, as if the weight that had been pressing against him for weeks had shifted entirely onto her. Her breath caught, and for an instant he saw in her face the same flicker of fear he had carried. The slab's vibration ceased. The air stilled. His mother's form blurred, dissolving into the night air like smoke. The grove was quiet again, save for the rustle of petals. The young woman looked at him as if expecting further instruction, but Thomas simply stepped back. "You'll know what to do when it's time." She nodded once and turned toward the slab, her steps slow but certain. Thomas left the grove without looking back. The hum was gone, but the silence in its place was not peace, it was absence, the kind that waits to be filled. In the records I've studied, the cycle never ends. It only changes hands. Magnolia Hills will call again, just as it always has. Perhaps the only real choice is whether we answer. And now I ask you, if the grove called your name, would you go? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Some legacies don't rest, and some doors should never be opened, yet they always are.